Assessment Quickies, Student Learning Outcomes Assessment in 10 Easy Steps. Step 8, Analyzing Evidence of Student Learning. Hi, my name is Michelle, and with the help of Professor Walter, we will provide answers to the most commonly asked questions. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to evaluate student work for evidence of student learning.
Okay, now we've collected piles of student work. What's next?
Well, you have 3 important decisions to make. Decide how to evaluate the student work as evidence of learning on the student learning outcome. Specify the criteria that are important in evaluating the work. And determine your standards or expectations for student learning.
By evaluate, do you mean what grade the student got?
Not necessarily. Let's say that you're going to establish an SLO that students will be able to act ethically. You're going to assess student learning on this SLO by having students complete an assignment and then collecting samples of student work.
How can we evaluate students' abilities to act ethically?
Okay, let's say that the faculty established 3 important criteria for judging student learning on ethics. One is, did the student identify the ethical situation? The next is, did the student apply an appropriate ethical perspective? And the third would be, did the student use a solution consistent with the perspective? Next, we define levels of performance, such as below expectations, meets expectations, or exceeds expectations. And we specify examples of what we mean by each level of performance for each of the criteria. On this slide, you can see a rubric. One way to proceed is to construct a rubric, which is a way of evaluating student work. It lists the major criteria for evaluating the student work, as well as examples of performance, say, below expectations, meet expectations, and exceeds expectations. So, for example, for identifies an ethical situation, below expectations is does not realize it's an ethical situation. Meets expectations means the student correctly identifies a situation as involving ethics. And exceeds expectations means the student expands on the ethical implications of the situation beyond what is provided. Finally, the faculty set the standard or how well they expect students will demonstrate their learning on ethics. Let's say the faculty set this standard that they want 95% of students to identify the ethical situation, 85% of students at least will describe an ethical perspective correctly, and 80% of students will suggest a solution consistent with that ethical perspective.
Okay, I see. Then we apply the rubric to the student essays, like scoring them.
Yes, exactly. At least 2 or 3 faculty, or in some cases, trained graduate students, should read each of the sample essays using the rubric, assign a level of performance to each, and summarize how many essays were at, below, or above expectations. Let's say that students overall met the expectation for identifying ethical situations. They did pretty well in correctly articulating an ethical perspective, 75% against 85%, but they didn't do quite so well in developing solutions consistent with their ethical perspective. They only obtained 50% instead of 80%.
So what does this mean?
Well, if you were doing this assessment, what would you say?
Well, I guess that we're doing a good job of teaching the theory and concepts of ethics, but not so good at teaching students how to apply ethics consistently in real-life situations.
And what would be the implications for the curriculum, the teaching and learning strategies, or the type of student assignments?
Well, I'd have to ask the faculty who teach in that area what they think.
Great. Remember, we are assessing the program, not individual students or faculty, and student success is the ultimate goal.
Now, what's the next step?
In the next podcast, we'll explain how to plan for using evidence of student learning for program improvement. And thanks for tuning in to this podcast.